Welcome back to Vision Heart Blog. I am Richard Warner. Thank you. This is number 10. I believe, yes, number 10. We're going to continue on a little bit. In the last episode or installment, I gave two very simple meditations, two simple forms of meditation that people who are starting to meditate or just beginning or curious even can practice. One of the things that's going to come out of meditation, one of the things one is going to very quickly realize is, or experience, is the mass of thoughts that are going to come up. Those trains that whip by and so on, they're going to go by so fast. There's going to be so much. One is actually going to be, at some point, probably become very frustrated at the sheer volume of these thoughts, the sheer volume, complexity of them. It may appear at first that you're never going to be able to get these things to calm down. The trick is not in dealing with each thought, not in getting caught up with each thought and what its story is, as it is so much as just allowing the process to happen. The more we concentrate on the breath and bringing the attention back to the breath in the first meditation, or the more we bring consciousness down into the heart and keep doing that, the more the thoughts are going to slow down. It's going to take a little bit of time. The mind's not used to this. This brings up the issue of why would we want to meditate? Why would one want to do this at all? At first, it might seem to be a frustrating thing. The mind is probably the most powerful thing in existence. Not just human existence, the mind, but because humans have minds, we have dominated the planet. We have dominated the life on the planet, and we're on the verge of destroying it because of the mind, because we have minds. And yet, how many of us are trained? How many cultures actually cultivate the mind, training of the mind? Certainly not in the Western Hemisphere. It's not, unless you're excluding the native population, the traditional native populations. Training of the mind is one of the most essential things you can do. And it is said in India, you could be a great king, a warrior of huge repute, who has conquered many nations, and you have subjected many people to your rule. But this is nothing in comparison to a man or a woman who has learned to control their mind. It is probably the most difficult thing that a human being can do. So don't get your hopes up too high when you're first starting, but trust that the process will work. Training of the mind is absolutely essential. All one has to do is have one of those sleepless nights or be caught up with something when one is in a disturbed state, problems at work, problems in relationships, problems with family, only to see how incredibly insane the mind can get. And sometimes one sits there in absolute wonder, wondering, what is going on? The more you're aware of the mind, you start to realize that this thing is running all by itself, without any control, without any discipline, and so on. And we are led into the strangest behaviors. How many times have we done things and thought, why did I do that? What was going on in my mind? The mind was just doing its thing. And the more we repeat an action, the more we repeat something, the more deeply ingrained it gets. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which is a ancient book on yoga, and yoga means training of the mind. It is not the word literally means union. Yoga is not about postures and so on. This is how we think in the West of yoga. If somebody says, I do yoga, they do hot yoga, or they do Ashtanga yoga or something. This is considered kind of the outer courtyard of yoga, preparing the body through different positions and breath and so on. But yoga is really about the mind, and it's all about training the mind. So in the Yoga Sutras, which is a collection of short aphorisms about training the mind, Patanjali's dates are in dispute and so on, but they're old. It's an old text. In the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, number 10, he talks about how the thoughts, how one can get to the source of the thoughts, and that's the root of where we get it. If we try to deal with each individual thought as it comes up, it's going to be overwhelming. In Vipassana meditation, one is observing these thoughts and not assessing them or getting involved in them, but looking at the sheer volume of these thoughts, letting them go by, hopefully allowing more space until they slow down. Eventually, when one becomes very accomplished, eventually the thinking process stops and one just sits there and is. There's just a pure, undisturbed consciousness. The first stage of this is called calm abiding, and that's what you have calm, and you are just abiding there. And then the occasional thought will flicker through. But when one first starts meditation, these thoughts are coming through just so much. It's overwhelming. And when I first started in Vipassana, I was watching this, and I started thinking about all the different aspects of these thoughts, these different selves, and so on. I was so overwhelmed. I went to the Vipassana meditation teacher on a break, and I asked him, there's so many thoughts, there's so many stories, there's so many different tendencies towards this, a tendency towards that, and a certain way that I react to this thought and that thought. I said, it's overwhelming. I said, how do I have to work it all out? Do I have to deal with each one of these things, these karmas, and karma just means the momentum of a tendency that one has created for oneself, and then their results. I thought, there's no end to this. There's no end to this. How do you possibly work all of this out? Each one of those different types of thoughts, each one of those different types of reactions, the stories and so on. So there's no way you'd be doing this for millions of years. How could you possibly do this? And he said, and it echoed the Yoga Sutras number 10 specifically. He said, it's not about that, it's more about the pure awareness. It's about the consciousness. In the commentary to Yoga Sutra number 10, Swami Satchidananda, and it's actually a really excellent book. Hopefully you can see that. It's the Yoga Sutras translation and commentary by Swami Satchidananda. It's actually very good. It's extremely good. Satchidananda talks about, in India, there's a particular herb, a plant that is used in Indian cooking called asafoetida, and it's extremely strong smell. It has a very, very strong smell, and so it's kept in a clay pot and kept aside. But because it has such a strong smell, even when the pot is empty and had been washed dozens and dozens of times, with the strongest of soaps, with so much water, over and over and over again, the smell stays in the pot. And these tendencies that we have in our mind are like the smell that taints pure consciousness. Actually, you know what? That's wrong. It's not pure consciousness. It's the ego. Okay? That's the smaller self. And that's where the ego gets its identity, from these repeated tendencies and so on, and it builds up a formation which becomes the personality, the personal you. Those are hard to get rid of. And if you do accept the idea of reincarnation, these tendencies may have actually been going on for several lifetimes. That becomes a little overwhelming when you think about that. The answer is to break the pot. Now, we're not breaking consciousness. Consciousness is the space beyond the pot. Consciousness is the space that the pot sits in, space around us. Akasha. Satchidananda says the only answer is to, in the end, break the pot. But at first we have to deal with the thoughts. And dealing with the thoughts is not buying into them or struggling with each one of them and trying to resolve each issue. There's no end to it. And as Christopher Titmuss told me, he said, it's all about bringing it back to that awareness. Awareness has been likened to the pure consciousness the awareness on the other side of the film of the ego, is what it's been likened to: a fire, to a flame. And eventually all the thoughts, if they're seen in the pure light of consciousness, dissolve. So quite simply, as overwhelming as this might seem, the answer, even when you're beginning to meditate, is just to bring the awareness back. It's the pure consciousness that breaks the pot, so to speak. Because those stains, apparently, of themselves, cannot be removed by conventional means. So psychology or just trying to deal with it yourself. Because how many times, I certainly, I can attest to this myself on a personal basis. There are thoughts that I have, that I've had my entire life, and even though I intellectually understand, which is dealing with the thoughts in the arena of the thoughts, I still have them. And even though I think they're not successful for me, they're not healthy for me, they provide no forward movement, they provide nothing of real benefit, and yet I still have them. That's because I'm dealing with it with the mind. And it's interesting when you take things back to that awareness, that space between the trains, that blue sky, unaffected by the clouds, they dissolve. They dissolve. Once one starts to get a sense, by seeing all those multiple eyes go by and asking, who am I? Which one of these eyes am I? And by experiencing, not thinking about or not intellectually realizing, but experiencing that calm, that space, that blue sky, the clouds dissolve. The train seems to disappear. So the need for training the mind is absolutely essential. But we don't train the mind by engaging the mind in its form. We train the mind by not putting our attention and our buy-in and putting our buy-in into it. We train the mind by giving it some space, not identifying with it, backing up and letting it slow down on its own, which it will, when the breath finally gets calmed down and so on, and we are able to concentrate more. The mind will become a servant and not a master. This sounds like a lot, but it's actually it can be done, even with people with the most difficult minds. And I can attest to this too. I have one of the most difficult minds to tame. This thing is going constantly. So if I've been able to gain even a little bit of that space, anyone can do this. Anyone can do this. And it's not something to be given up. And the more you do this, even if you do that little 2 minutes, even if you get a little bit of that experience every day, 2 minutes, here and there, 5 minutes, once you start to see it for yourself, once you start to experience it for yourself, you will see why we train the mind, how its benefits can happen, and you will want to do this. Because I think probably the greatest thing in human existence that causes the greatest amount of suffering is the mind. I thank you for watching. Hopefully that this has been useful. I want to do my best to make sure that I can pass on information that's useful. It's coming from my experience. I'm not a meditation master. I'm not an academic. I'm not a professor. I'm just sharing these ideas with you. I've had a lot of experience and a lot of very different, been through a lot of very different things, and that's the context that I want this to be seen in. I'm sharing these ideas with you, and I'm not an authoritative source, but I'm hoping that the fact that this has been an experience and it's untrammeled by a lot of authoritative weight, shall we say, and that I'm just a regular guy who's been through a few things, I'm hoping that this is something that will encourage others to open their minds and to see the need for us to do so in this world that is becoming out of control with mental activity. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.